This is a Roqe Media series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 20. Hi there, and welcome to the Contemporary History of Iran, a series from Roqe Media. This is Part 20, Foreign Policy Under the Ayatollahs. I'm Jian Ghomeshi. Our aim with this series is to explore the events, personalities, and issues that have shaped modern Iran. We want to do this as much as possible through a non-traditional lens, through snapshots of change, and using alternative voices or angles. This series is mostly in English and will feature a new episode posted every Thursday across our Roqe Media platforms. We will post subtitled excerpts with Farsi Zirnavis on our YouTube and Instagram sites. We are coming to you on roqemedia.com. It is there that you can link to all of our platforms, and we invite you to check out parts 1 through 19 of this series that are already posted. To become a sponsor or patron of Roqe Media, please contact us through our website. The Contemporary History of Iran is brought to you in part by Yazdani Law Group. YLG is one of the largest Iranian-Canadian immigration law firms. Their mission, rooted in the leadership of founder Afshin Yazdani, is built on continuously striving to innovate and introduce new immigration pathways for their clients. Afshin began his career as a lawyer and law professor in Iran, and his company has now made it their goal to provide the best, simplest, least risky, and most inexpensive way to immigrate to Canada. YLG has an impressive track record, hundreds of applications from Iran successfully processed every year. They are at YLGPC on Instagram. That is Yazdani Law Group. All right, let's get started. Here now is the Contemporary History of Iran, Part 20. Well, it is impossible to assess the contemporary history of Iran without a look at how Iran chooses to interact with the rest of the world. We have, in previous episodes in this series, discussed the foreign policy aims of, say, Prime Minister Mossadegh in the early 1950s, or Reza Shah in trying to navigate the imperial powers in the lead up to World War II, or the very close relationship of Mohammad Reza Pahlavi with the United States in the 1970s. But what about after the revolution of 1979 that changed everything in Iran? How are we to make sense of the way Iran has dealt with the world in the last 43 years? What has been the intent and what has been the approach? On this episode, we want to take a very elemental look at the Iranian foreign policy approach since the revolution of 1979 and its shifts, its contradictions, and its continuities. My featured guest for this topic is someone who has recently published a very well-received book on this very subject. Dr. Ali Fathollah-Nejad is a German-Iranian political scientist with an interest in Iran, the Middle East, and the post-unipolar world order. He is an associate fellow with the American University of Beirut's Issam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, and he's the author of the monthly brief Iran in Focus. Dr. Fathollah-Nejad has taught at the University of Tübingen, the PhD program at Qatar University's Gulf Studies Center, and at FU Berlin's Center for Middle Eastern and North African Politics, to name just a few of his stops. He received his doctorate in international relations from the University of London and was the recipient of a postdoctoral fellowship with the Harvard Kennedy School's Iran Project. He has been an Iran expert at the Brookings Institution in Doha and with the German Council on Foreign Relations, and he's a frequent speaker at academic conferences and political forums and regularly contributes to leading international media outlets in English, German, and French. His new book, released in 2021, is entitled Iran in the Emerging New World Order, From Ahmadinejad to Rouhani. And right now, Dr. Ali Fathollah-Nejad joins me from Berlin, Germany. Hello, sir.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
It's a great pleasure to have you on the program, and you've written a most interesting book, and it's not going to be easy to cover a few decades of Iranian foreign policy in 1 hour, but my hope is that we can do so and do so in a sort of elemental and accessible manner whilst still using your expertise. Yes?
Yes, I hope so too, and I'm looking forward to the conversation.
So, I thought I would start with the revolution itself, which you discuss in the book in the way to getting to the last couple of decades that you focus on. In the first months of the revolution of 1979 and the ousting of the monarchy in Iran, there was not yet an exclusively Islamist government. Rather, it was actually pluralistic in its foreign policy quest, seemingly. You talk about independence via non-alignment as the grand strategic preference of folks like Mehdi Bazargan, who became the first prime minister of this new Islamic republic. The idea of a non-aligned foreign policy stance would actually go back to Mossadegh. Can you describe it?
Well, absolutely. I mean, in order to understand, of course, Iranian foreign policy, it's indispensable to look at the tremendous changes that we've seen with the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Yet, independence as a leitmotif is quite key in understanding Iranian foreign policy, also going back to the pre-revolutionary era. And this idea of non-alignment very much goes back to the Mossadegh era that you've discussed with other guests on your program. And his idea of negative equilibrium. And the idea is basically not to be attached to any great powers or superpower, neither any Western superpowers, be it at first the British Empire, but then the so-called American Empire, but also not to attach itself too much to the Eastern camp, so to speak, the Soviet Union, which is now Russia. So it is basically being independent from great power tutelage. And because you have seen in the history of modern Iran over the past 200 years or so, several instances of colonial infringement. And of course, the 1953 coup against Mossadegh that was, chiefly initiated by the British and the Americans, but also was aided by domestic forces. Was a important turning point in making this idea quite central to Iranian foreign policy identity. And if you look at different Iranian political cultures, which I also identify or discuss in the book, yes, which are nationalism, Islamism, and socialism, you see that all of them, despite their differences, would agree on this common denominator of pursuing an independent foreign policy, which is still, up until today, very much on Iranians' minds. And it is, interesting to see how it goes today, actually.
Let me get to that. But just, sorry, parenthetically, where does the term negative equilibrium come from?
So basically, the idea, as I said, that you detach yourself from both, major powers of the time. You don't seek any kind of, strategic game into it, by, for instance, allying with the one side against the other. So it's basically being independent from those great powers that can actually, do some infringement on your rights, on your sovereignty, and so forth.
I see. I guess the negative is just saying no, and you
yes,
balance through saying no. When we just before we get to the post-revolutionary period, just in terms of what leads up to that, the orthodox expectation So the knee-jerk idea is that foreign policy before the revolution under the rule of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, especially in the years after 1953, is all about the embrace of the West. Is that a fair assumption, or is that too simple?
Well, I think, first of all, I'm not a historian, but I think this may be, an accurate description, but yet probably not being complex enough. The reality is, of course, that what we've seen with the Iranian Revolution is that from one day to the other, Iran, from being the most important partner of the United States in the Middle East, came to be its most important foe. So this is a huge transformation, of course. And it was, we had this kind of embrace of the West, as you put it, back then. There is no doubt about that. And also the Shah's rule was also due because of the intervention that those Western powers did in Iran, who helped him in this rule and his autocracy. And all of that, even the SAVAK, the intelligence service of the Shah was, basically set up by the Americans and the Israeli Mossad, by the American CIA and the Israeli Mossad. So there is a strong embrace. Of course, there's a clear geopolitical preference, but also a civilizational preference of the Shah of Iran toward the West. And this has, been on display on numerous, on the way of life that he tried to emulate. And for instance, his celebration of assumedly 2,500 years of Persian Empire.
Right.
And Persepolis, a few years before the revolution, was, basically very much emulating this Western model. Everything imported was almost French. So it was very clear that there is this kind of ambition. But then again, it's not that surprising, because after all, the West was quite developed and was it was the developed world. It was this industrialized world. And I think it's not surprising that in the state of development that Iran found itself, they would look to the West to copy. But then the Shah, of course, got overambitious, so to speak, and he wanted not only to emulate the West, but to be much better than the West. An important element in this kind of perhaps megalomaniac self-esteem was in the wake of the 1973 oil embargo, which Iran very much benefited from.
Yes.
And so Iran would export a lot of oil, and Arab countries would not do that because of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And Iran got windfall revenues. And at that time, even the Shah of Iran was giving credit, I think, of $1 billion loans to both the French and British governments, to cope with this crisis that, was overwhelming across Western societies because of the over-dependence of oil, of course. In the latter years, preceding the 79 revolution, the Shah got much more emboldened and went on to criticize his, so to speak, former masters, which then, also led to his to those Western powers being disillusioned with him and being ready to look for an alternative, maybe.
When you talk about the independence, that theme of independence or non-alignment being something that's been an underlying theme over the last few decades. This was actually, as Khomeini consolidates the Khomeinyists consolidate the revolution in the early 80s. This is the revolutionary slogan, right? Neither East nor West, neither Eastern nor Western, but Islamic Republic. And I understand the symbolic nature of demonstrating independence and an anti-imperial line, but in a granular level, what did Iran really have to gain by isolating itself from West and East?
Well, that's a very good question that is still, very much discussed up until today. But you're absolutely right. The key slogan, one of the key slogans of the Iranian Revolution, if not the key slogan, was neither West nor the East. Na Gharb na Sharq, faqat Jumhuriya Islami, only the Islamic Republic. So there was a detachment from both, Eastern and Western superpowers because of both of them, not only the Western side had infringed upon Iranian rights. I mean, the Russian also, I mean, there is a history of Russian also colonialism in Iran.
Sure.
So all of that stemmed from, not only the 1953 coup against Mossadegh, but from the wider experience of modern Iran of the last 200 years with those two colonial powers. And given the zeitgeist of the 1960s and 70s, which was, after all, a period of decolonization, I mean, starting, of course, in the 1950s, but all over the world, also in the West, we had quite a hegemony of leftist ideas. And so the same was true in the political debates in Iran. And of course, Mossadegh, with his oil nationalization plan that, drew the ire of the Western powers against him and led eventually to his overthrow, was, of course, the first leader of the so-called Third World to make such a claim of independence and of real sovereignty that led eventually to the founding in 1961 of the non-aligned movement, an organization of different global southern states that still exists up until today, but was very much, of course, characterized by the figures of Mossadegh, but later Gamal Abdel Nasser, Sukarno in Indonesia, Nkrumah in Ghana, Nehru in India. So all of that was part and parcel of a zeitgeist that fed the ideational architecture and worldview and Weltanschauung of the various Iranian revolutionary movements in the 1960s and 70s that led to the 1979 revolution, that eventually fed and nurtured this kind of independence leitmotif that came out of it. And for the Iranians, they proposed, well, we have an alternative to the East and West, which is the Islamic Republic. And of course, this was not the Iranians who, majorly proposed that, but it was very much the, Islamist forces, Khomeini, who pushed for this idea. But this was the kind of claim that the new regime then had to offer a third way, so to speak, which was the Islamic Republic.
Again, it seems at best, I mean, the enthusiasm for the neither East nor West, beyond the catchy slogan, seems at best idealistic and at worst almost juvenile. I mean, during the hostage crisis, there's this dictum from Khomeini that reads, "We must isolate ourselves in order to become independent." I mean, in this way, Iran's international isolation was being sold almost as a blessing of some sort, yes?
Absolutely. And this is, this turned out to be, just the very opposite till today. I mean, first of all, if you look at the validity of this slogan today, you see that, well, after all, I mean, especially after the hostage crisis, the Islamic Republic became a very clear anti-American regime. Despite the fact that, I mean, even Khomeini had contact with the CIA, as we know from declassified documents that were released over the last few years, by assuring them, actually, if he comes to power, it would be no threat to American interests. But because of his thirst for power and consolidating power against those rivaling interests, because after all, the Iranian Revolution was not at the beginning an Islamic revolution, it was a plurivocal movement consisting of, the various stripes of nationalist, socialist, and Islamist, groups and ideas. Then got into, Islamizing state and society later on, but. After the hostage crisis, Khomeini just abused that in order to consolidate its power, and then from then on, it was very clear that it was very anti-American. Whereas the anti-Russian component, the neither Eastern component, then became more and more into kind of a quasi-dependency on those non-Western great powers over the decades, because the Islamic Republic sought to seek a balance against US and Western pressure by aligning to those non-Western great powers, such as Russia and China, and with both of whom the Islamic Republic over the last few years now, just very recently,
Yes.
forged 25 or 20-year agreements. And what I argue is that it has now, put itself in a state of also dependency vis-a-vis Russia and China, thus very much undermining this key ambition of the Iranian Revolution to be independent from both Eastern and the Western camps.
And of course, the independence, again, was the third way, to steal Tony Blairism. It was in this case the Islamic Republic, neither East nor West. You make the argument that in the immediate wake of the 1979 revolution, not only a process of Islamization of state and society was initiated by these new rulers, Khomeini, but Iranian foreign policy gets Islamized too. How do you Islamize a foreign policy?
Well, I'm heavily relying on the work of a major Iranian scholar in the United States, Rouhani Ramazani, who made a distinction between Iran firsters and Islam firsters. Right after the Iranian Revolution of '79, with Islam firsters being, the kind of perspective being promoted by Khomeini, and the hostage crisis was key in providing the Islam firsters with their final victory, with their definitive victory. And then the other, Iran firsters were very much sidelined, if not repressed. So the hostage crisis and the abuse of Khomeini was instrumental in this kind of Islamizing of foreign policy. And the sad part is that if you pursue such an ideologically invested kind of approach against the West, you might lose sight of the other patterns of dependency that you may be confronted with.
But what does it? What does it even actually mean? I mean, does it mean, okay, we're going to assess our relationship with Germany based on Islam? I mean, how do you Islamize a foreign policy?
So basically what it means is that on several grounds. I mean, first of all, it very much pertains to the very political structure the Islamic Republic has put up in the country, institutionalized after the revolution. And this is somehow projected onto foreign policy, both on its regional, when it comes to its neighbors. I mean, Khomeini was calling for those Arab neighbors of Iran to stand up against their own leaders, which he portrayed as Western lackeys. And so, of course, this created a lot of conflict. Also, was providing the ground for the emergence of the Iran-Iraq War at some point. And up until today, the cultivation of like-minded Islamic groups, Islamist groups in the Middle East by the Islamic Republic, this proxy network that the Islamic Republic has established for over 40 years now, initially with the establishment of Hezbollah, which is a Shia Islamist political organization that was, created by the Iranians. So there was a huge ambition to export the revolution.
Yes.
I mean, this was also the motto, one of the mottos of the revolution, or especially of the Khomeini.
I was going to ask you about that. What is the, I mean, because as you say, embedded in the Khomeini's Islamized foreign policy is this discourse around exporting the revolution. And as I was reading that in your book, I was thinking, I actually remember, I mean, I was a kid at the time, but I remember this talk of exporting the revolution. What was the dream? Is the dream that the Islamic Republic becomes a new kind of Persian Empire or something?
Well, maybe because, there is a lot of continuity between the two regimes in terms of their megalomaniac aspirations, for sure. And there is a well-ingrained also factor of Iranian nationalism that is also not wholly opposed to this idea of reestablishing kind of empire, be it under the Shah or even under the Ayatollahs. They actually, one could also put it that way, that the Islamic Republic had the ambition to create, a third-way empire. So it was interesting, but it's also contradictory because, on the one hand, one would say, well, one is against imperialism, U.S. or British, one is against Zionism or colonialist Zionism.
We don't like imperialism unless we're the imperialists.
Exactly,
Right.
And there is there was this Islamic, Islamist, aspiration of exporting the revolution, which at first sight might be in contradistinction with those other Western or Eastern imperialism, but there is also a lot of similarities. And of course, there was this, very much, ingrained idea by many Islamist forces all over the globe to have a universal aspiration, a global ambition. So Khomeini had a global ambition that went far beyond only, the Shia communities or even only the Islamic communities. And which was also quite popular even with some anti-imperialist movements. So it was probably, in a nutshell, a combination of anti-imperialism and Islamism.
You mentioned nationalism, and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about nationalism, because both the Shah in the Pahlavi era and then the rulers in the new Khomeini era utilize Iranian nationalism as a way of boosting power and making their case. The Shah, especially in the 70s, is ostensibly making foreign policy decisions and rulings with an agenda of recognizing Iran's great past. You mentioned Persepolis, invoking it with some road to a great future. And then Khomeini uses nationalism of a different stripe for his own goals as a way to unite the country against the monarchy, and then a rallying cry when the Iran-Iraq war happens. How do we make sense of the shifting symbolism of nationalism in this massive regime change in the late 70s and how it gets used with respect to foreign policy?
Well, I think Khomeini actually did rather pursue another idea, which is detesting the notion of nationalism, saying this is a term and concept derived from the decadent West. So hence, he was an Islam firster and not an Iran firster, to take up the distinction by Ruhollah Ramazani. Instead, he would favor the idea of the Ummah, of the Islamic world community. So he was very much, and up until today, a lot of Islamists are very much uneasy, to put it very mildly, with the idea of nationalism, which they regard as a degraded concept, as a decadent concept that should be opposed. Instead to promote this idealized version of a Islamic world community that doesn't know of any national boundaries. So this was a main distinction between the two regimes. And
right, but when he's rallying, when Khomeini's rallying and gaining support, and in fact consolidating his power at the beginnings of the Iran-Iraq war, isn't he using nationalism as a tool, or are you saying, or is the argument that if it's Islam first, that he's using Islam as the rallying cry rather than Iran?
It was very much Islam as the first rallying cry. Of course, Shia Islam can be seen as a kind of Iranian religious nationalism as well, because after all, Iran is the major Shia country.
Right.
Not to say that it's the epicenter of it, but it's a major Shia country in the world. So, Shia Islam is a kind of religious nationalism as well, one could put it. But then within the new ideological framework of the Islamic Republic, at the very first phases of the Islamic Republic, there was a very clear dominance and supremacy of Islamism, of Shia Islamism. And whereas over the last few decades, we could more see the outlines of a mix between Islamism and nationalism in the ideological framework of the Islamic Republic.
Right.
So up until today, I would say that both Islamism and nationalism play a dominant role. And we've seen the first probably instance where the nationalist discourse got very much at the forefront is during the hardline president Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who more strongly than probably his predecessors relied on some nationalist elements. The developments over the last few years and why nationalism became, or is increasing in importance is also because of the realization by many among the regime leadership that Islamism as a rallying cry has lost much of its erstwhile appeal with the Iranians. So relying on nationalism, they hope, would be able to more easily create what we call a rallying around the flag effect.
Yeah. The revolution wasn't exported. It hasn't happened, right? In terms of Islam being the thing that really captures the imagination in terms of the way the Khomeinists saw it.
Well, I think it did in some way. I mean, in the earlier phase, for sure.
In the earlier phase, maybe.
Hezbollah set up. So this is a prime example that it actually worked quite, successfully up until today, where Hezbollah is arguably the most important political factor in Lebanon. So it's worked. This exporting of revolution worked, but it actually, in order to have peaceful coexistence with the neighbors, it created discord with the Sunni leaders that the Tehran leadership would just characterize as Western lackeys. So up until today, this create and then to set up semi-state and proxy groups in your neighbors' countries that would challenge their states. So
for sure, Iran's been disruptive. I'm more thinking, can we name a country in the world that's gone, we want to be the new Islamic Republic, just like Iran? I mean, it hasn't exactly inspired copycats, has it?
Not at a larger level, you're absolutely correct. But at a smaller level, at a sub-state level, yes, it did, because the Iranian Revolution, after all, was the emergence into the scene of global politics of what we call today political Islam. So this idea is very much come to fruition and into realization, into implementation by the Islamic Revolution, or its so-called Islamic Revolution in Iran. And it was emulated by many groups. And of course, yes, so this promise of the exporter of the revolution was only successful partly.
Just before I leave the idea of nationalism, there's something you do in your book that I think I always find these juxtapositions so interesting, because you do point out some continuity between the Pahlavi era and the post-revolution era. With respect to nationalism, you point out at one point, I want to quote you, you say, there forms a remarkable continuity between apparently fundamentally opposed personalities or regimes of Mohammad Reza Shah and Ayatollah Khomeini, who become both portrayed as national saviors. And so if you can explore that continuity for a moment, I think it's very interesting.
Well, I think we've mentioned a few elements before. What I would add is, of course, the national savior, element to it is also, we have to include the Iran-Iraq war that started in 1980, and which Khomeini, abused. And also, he could have ended it after 2 years, but actually, he did not, in order to maintain and to consolidate the power of the newly established Islamic Republic and his idea of the guardianship of the, or of the dominance of the clergy in politics in Iran. So in this context, of course, he would portray himself to be a national savior. And before, a national savior that would be at the helm of a revolutionary movement that, very much was against the Shah, but was not so sure about what alternatives to set up. So on two fronts, in the struggle against the Shah, he was, of course, trying to portray himself as a national savior, although he would more pronouncedly insist on the importance of Islam than on Iran. So, you can see that with numerous speeches of Khomeini. Even very much epitomized when he came back, almost 43 years ago, with this Air France plane, came back from his French exile to Iran. After the Shah had fled as a result of the revolutionary movement that had galvanized. So he was asked what kind of feeling he had when, after all, he was returning to his home country after decades of exile. And he said basically nothing. Yes. He said nothing. So he has no emotional, no emotions. So, which is also interesting, which is also not very much, a supreme example of a nationalist feeling, right?
Right.
So, and then also, and in terms of Mossadegh, he said, well, I mean, it's good that we got rid of Mossadegh, because if he had stayed in power, he would have slapped Islam. So, so there's also, again, this, insistence on Islam rather than Iran. So, of course, there is similarities between the two, but there are distinct, emphasis from both as well.
I want to get to the foreign policy under Khatami in the late 90s, and then how it shifts under Ahmadinejad. Just before we do that, there's this moment. So we've talked about the beginning of the revolution in Khomeini, and then the reformist movement, if as one way of calling it, that begins in the late 90s with President Khatami. There's a delta between that. There's a gap between that. How would you characterize Iranian foreign policy in that reconstruction period after the Iran-Iraq War, but before the ill-fated sort of reformist shift?
Yeah. So basically, one usually, distinguishes between different post-revolutionary periods. So definitely the first decade of the 1980s was one of the consolidation of the state during the Iran-Iraq War, which of course had also various impacts upon Iranian state and society. But at the end of the Iran-Iraq War coincided also with the demise of Ayatollah Khomeini, that charismatic leader who got at the forefront of the revolutionary movement at some point and who got into Islamizing state and society. So we're now talking about the end of the 1980s, where this first post-revolutionary period, ends, and then comes the so-called, as you suggested, phase of reconstruction after the 8-year war, which was the most, devastating war after World War II. With huge, human losses on both sides, but also huge losses for the Iranian side, because after all, Iran was quite, on the path of industrialization before the revolution, and a lot of things were destroyed. So there was, the very objective need to reconstruct the country, and this would be done by also one of the founding fathers of the Islamic Republic, the late Akbar Hashemi Rafsanjani, who then became president of Iran, who also at that time pushed Ali Khamenei to become the new supreme leader after the demise of Khomeini. And Rafsanjani had, a more, let's say, realistic and less ideological kind of approach to various issues. And he would also try to mend relations with not only the neighbors, but also the West. So this was the ambition also during the 1990s preceding. And of course, I mean, it was partly successful because after all, there is no, regardless of the president, it is very difficult for any president of the Islamic Republic to really mend relations with the West until normalizing it, because after all, anti-Americanism remains a indispensable pillar of the Islamic Republic up until today. But then came the reformist period, starting with the election of President Mohammad Khatami in 97.
And with that, with the coming of the reformist President Khatami in 97, there's this rapprochement with the West, or this attempted rapprochement with the West. There's certainly a clear reparation of foreign relations with Europe, for example. How effective do you think the Khatami years were in reshaping Iranian foreign policy?
Well, I'm not sure about reshaping because, after all, the president is not the most important figure in the political institutions of the Islamic Republic. It's the supreme leader. Although there was, also different dynamics in the relationship between the president and the supreme leader. But be it as it may, the Khatami era was quite transformative in the discourse that he espoused. He talked also in an era of, some Western scholars talking about a clash of civilizations. He said that, we ought to replace it by a dialogue of civilizations, which was also, taken up by the United Nations at some point. And so this was very much a new idea that he was, espousing and giving this famous CNN interview with Christiane Amanpour. And all of that made the semblance that, well, he might be a Gorbachev of the Islamic Republic. And there was a lot of discussion, a lot of euphoria because of his discourse of a dialogue of civilizations. But then I think, despite this discourse, this did not lead to a normalization of relations with the United States, but it did lead to much better ties with Western Europe, although those ties had also existed previously under Rafsanjani, and arguably also in the 1980s at some instances.
In a more clandestine way. Yeah.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And also in terms of arms exports, although, I mean, the West would also, deliver weapons to both Saddam Hussein's Iraq and the Islamic Republic of Khomeini. But coming back to the Khatami era, the Mykonos murders, which is Mykonos is a Greek restaurant here in Berlin, where during the Khatami era, there were, dissidents meeting, many of them Kurdish, Iranian dissidents. Yes. So the Iranians basically put up agents and organized agents who shot them in the restaurant and killed all of them. That really was the turning point in Iranian-European relations, at least. So that led to a diplomatic and political crisis with the German court, after that, saying that the order for those murders came directly from the highest leadership of the Islamic Republic, including, Hashemi Rafsanjani. And so this soured the relations, and a so-called critical discourse period was set up in relations between Europe and Iran. So this was, in a nutshell, Khatami was talking about something new. And that was certainly also to the distaste of more hardline elements in Iran. But again, those hardline elements are very much in charge of various aspects of Iranian domestic and foreign policy. So this idea of mending relations, to the fullest, and also going toward meaningful normalization of relations with the West never happened.
But it's interesting that if we go back to that neither West nor East slogan or idea of the immediate post-revolution idea, if you look at the last few decades, I mean, it's based on what I read in your book and what we've observed, it seems like a bit of a pinball between cozying up to either the West or attempts at rapprochement with the West, and then going back towards the East, and then West and East. So after the Rafsanjani and Khatami eras, there's this new this neoconservative period, epitomized by the election of the former mayor of Tehran, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, to become the new president. And under Ahmadinejad, the foreign policy political orientation shifts clearly east. What did that actually mean, and why?
Well, this Eastern ambition, it's interesting because it seems to be at odds with this kind of, revolutionary motto of nor Western, neither Eastern. But as you say, the geopolitical preference to forge closer relations with non-Western great powers was very much elevated during the term of President Ahmadinejad. And this, of course, coincided with the neocon government administration in Washington, and with its post 9/11 global war on terror, that very much was at the same time. So this was, there was no surprise then that Iran would seek non-Western partners to balance out this kind of pressure from the West. But Ahmadinejad, at the same time, he was also engaged in writing letters to American presidents. So it's not that he was, totally.
Which is really weird based on what he was saying. His
exactly
rhetorical attacks.
He would offer Iran to be the manager of global conflicts. Like also mimicking or displaying megalomaniac ambitions, as if Iran would be a global superpower. to be able to, engage on the same levels as US or China. But then the very idea, the Ahmadinejad period comes also within a international system that is experiencing a change. Because what we've seen is that with the 1990s, with incredible GDP growth from China, but also India, what we've seen is a shift of the economic center of gravity on this planet from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And this was also not lost to Iranian observers, who would therefore argue that, well, the US or the West is in decline because the geoeconomic center of gravity is shifting toward Asia. And so not only we hate the West because of various ideological and political reasons, also economically, it makes less sense to focus on them because after all, there are going to be much more important economic actors emerging in the East. So this was very much driving, up until today, the so-called look to the East that prominently first emerged during the Ahmadinejad era, which has now been resurfaced with the current hardline government in Iran, led by Ebrahim Raisi.
Yes.
So this is the kind of ambition. This kind of center of gravity shifting from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Secondly, there are political economic power centers in Iran that have been very much arguing also for this look to the East, because not only because of ideological and political distaste for the West, but this is surely an aspect, but also because they would just prefer to deal with like-minded autocracies, because there is little,
right.
little.
It's easier to do business with another autocracy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
China and Russia are not going to table human rights when they talk to Iran. So this is much easier to deal with them, and also, so this is because this is why the main figure pushing for the look to the East is the supreme leader of Iran, Ali Khamenei.
Well, this is what I was going to ask you. This is probably a naive. I have no idea how this works in the state, the power state of Iran, of contemporary Iran. I have a sense of it in, say, the United States, and who the power brokers are, even the corporate power brokers, and the military industrial complex, and the president sits down with who he sits down with and makes these decisions or whatever. But in Iran, say in 2006, 2007, is Ahmadinejad going to the supreme leader and saying, hey man, China is that's where we should be doing business? Who's making these decisions?
Well, the strategic decisions about both Iranian domestic politics and foreign policy is derived from the same centers of power. And when it comes to key national security and foreign policy decisions, there is an architecture of decision making in Iran. So it's not only a wholly totalitarian system where Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei decides everything on its own. Whereas, although he can be surely, and as I do so in my book, he can be considered to be the chief ideologue of the Islamic Republic, and he has a lot of power, and so his speeches do matter a lot. So this is very important. One aspect. The other aspect is that there is a whole foreign policy and national security apparatus in Iran, where, for instance, we have this body called the Supreme National Security Council, something that's also in quite other form exists in other countries. For instance, in the United States with the NSC, which is the main elite body deciding on national security and foreign policy issues. So where the supreme leader has its own representatives, the former so-called moderate president of Iran, Hassan Rouhani, was the representative of Khamenei in this very body for 20 years before becoming president. So you see that the kind of distinction, the kind of very clear distinction that we suggest in many Western countries between, let's say, the moderate elite camp or the reformist elite camp on one hand, and on the other hand, the hardliners, does not really exist that clear cut in reality. So, but at the end of the day, the supreme leader has the final say. And of course, together with another key center of power in Iran, which we did not mention explicitly, which is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which was established as a kind of guardian for the regime after the revolution by Khomeini.
Yes.
But who expanded after the 1990s when Rafsanjani opened the way for their involvement into the economy as an expansive economic empire. So it's a military economic conglomerate that exists, that has a lot of say also in terms of all those strategic domestic and foreign policy decisions.
Notwithstanding what really actually changes or doesn't change, the starkest contrast, or perhaps amongst the starkest contrasts between Khatami and that era and Ahmadinejad, is the tone. You talk about Khatami and the Christian Amanpour interview. Ahmadinejad was known more than anyone for his vociferous rhetorical attacks against Israel and the U.S. What was his agenda in launching those attention-getting salvos?
I think very clearly it was to extend Iranian, let's say, popularity, if not legitimacy, in the Middle East. Because if you look at this period of post 9/11, and if you look at various surveys and polls being made in the Middle East, you see that, well, Ahmadinejad may be the most popular because he saw the vacuum of Middle Eastern leaders who are allied with the United States, and who would not dare to criticize the policies of Israel that became more expansive and more aggressive during that period against the Palestinians. So Ahmadinejad would seize this opportunity to portray first of all, to signal to the so-called Arab street, although I don't like this term because it somehow, sounds pejorative. But he saw his appeal among the Arab populations of the Middle East by driving a very clear anti-imperialist and Zionist discourse, which after all was quite successful in elevating Iranian soft power throughout the region at that time. But this was only possible because there was a vacuum left by those Arab leaders who would not dare to publicly criticize the United States or Israel. So this was also, I think, a very clever move by Ahmadinejad, of course, which, the rest of that is ingrained in his own ideology. And also which is very much, the ideology of various components of the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Before I get to a final question, and by the way, it's really interesting getting to talk to you about all this. I really appreciate your insights, and I really thank you for the time you've given us. I want to ask you a final question about the Supreme Leader, because he's formed the subtext of the entire hour, which is perhaps not a surprise when you talk about where the power resides. But before we get there, just in terms of, and you've given a nod to it a couple of times, in terms of the current state of Iranian foreign policy, what can we learn from what you've just been talking about, the recent decades of Iranian foreign policy movement, to inform us around the new growing relationship with the East?
I think what one could say for sure is that despite the noble motivations of many of the ideals of the Iranian Revolution, especially its foreign policy dimension, independence from great power tutelage, we've entered very early on, despite this motto, into a very clear obsession with anti-Westernism and anti-Western sentiments that, of course, has also its historical reasons for sure. But this, very open and very radical anti-American sentiments that became the main ideology, one could say, of the Islamic Republic, set the developmental trajectory of the Islamic Republic, of post-revolutionary Iran, on a wrong foot. And it slowly but surely moved the Islamic Republic into a path of dependency vis-a-vis Eastern great powers, Russia and China notably, because they would see them as Iranian allies against American hegemony. But the reality is that it's not as simple as that. For all those Eastern great powers, their respective relationship with the United States is much more important than their relationship with Iran. So because of this, Iran has found itself in a structural position of weakness, where Russia, powers like Russia and China, can abuse Iran's perennial conflict with the West, knowing that, normalizing relations between Iran and the West, if not a chimera, would take a long time to materialize.
Yes.
So, all those deals that the Islamic Republic has forged with China for 25 years, and the planned one with Russia for 20 years, we don't know the details. The details are not published, as all secret, and it remains a highly controversial topic in Iran, because the fear is that regime is selling out.
Yes.
Because of unprecedented pressure from below, because of the protests that have happened over the last few years in Iran, which was the core of my research actually over the last few years.
By the way, not selling out metaphorically, but actually selling the country out, right? It's that's
exactly. What we know for sure, because there are a lot of what we don't know because it's secret, right? There's a lot of speculations and rumors. Is that Iran is selling China for probably a decade, 2 decades now, oil at a discount level, because it needs China to help it on the international diplomatic and political scene. There's also a different mood across Iranian society, which is so they always say America, but the enemy is right at home. So this has been a main slogan chanted by many different groups across Iranian society, that shows that this anti-American sentiment is no more able to create a rallying around the flag effect. Hence, the more prominent role that's probably nationalism going to take in this kind of Islamist nationalist amalgam in the ideological structure of the Islamic Republic. But the look to the East ambition is per se putting Iran in a position of weakness, as long as it does not normalize relations with the West. So as a conclusion, the ideal motto of foreign policy would be not neither Eastern nor Western, but both Eastern and Western. Right. But in order to be able to more easily benefit from the look to the East orientation, Iran has to sort out its problems with the West first, especially with the United States. And as long as this does not exist, it will remain in this structural position of weakness that it had put itself into it.
It's an excellent summary. Although I'll step on it by asking one final question, which is, as I promised, I wanted to ask about the Supreme Leader. And when you talk about the West, I'm not sure. I can't always entirely figure this Supreme Leader out. In the 2000s, right up to today, of course, Iran is under the control of the Supreme Leader, and it's hard to entirely make sense of his actions with respect to foreign policy sometimes. On the one hand, he is clearly often seen as the hardliner, obsessed with the U.S., utterly suspicious of its intentions, which he sees as, ultimately geared toward nothing less than the destruction of the Islamic Republic as a system. On the other hand, it was Khamenei who, in the wake of Obama's election, lifted the taboo on normalizing ties with Washington, something that seems to be in play again today. How do we make sense of that?
Yeah, this is true. And whereas he loves to portray the West as global arrogance, and yet the Islamic Republic then, strikes a deal with global arrogance, the very power that one is, radically against. And the reason for this is regime security and regime stability that will, the kind of primacy of probably much of the Islamic Republic's strategic culture that goes back to the Khomeini era. And this idea that if the Islamic Republic as a state is in danger, one could even do things that might be against Islam in order to maintain power. So this idea goes back to Khomeini, and also the concept of drinking the cup of poison, which Khomeini said he would do when accepting the ceasefire to the Iran-Iraq war. But this cup of poison was also drunk by Khamenei with the Iran nuclear deal in 2015, at a time which I explain in great length in my book, came against the backdrop of heavy US sanctions pressure, the kind of crippling sanctions that we've seen against Iran during the Obama era, for instance, which at some point led to a different cost-benefit calculation that actually the Iranians cannot, no longer resist, and resistance is the kind of prominent policy that is designed to be pursued against this kind of global arrogance. Resistance was probably too costly, by driving up, for instance, the nuclear program and so forth back then, the kind of same strategy that Iran has been pursuing over the last few years after Trump's withdrawal. So once sanctions got from hard to severe, or to put it different, or from severe to extreme, when there was a qualitative shift, when the Europeans had joined the US oil embargo, the Islamic Republic would understand that, well, for regime security and for regime income, this would not be something sustainable. Hence, one would have to agree to forge a deal with the United States. Hence, the green light of the anti-American Khamenei to seek direct talks with the United States in Oman, the so-called Oman Channel. A few years of discussions between the Iranian and American sides, direct discussions that preceded the kind of public diplomacy that we've seen with the so-called moderate administration of President Hassan Rouhani and his foreign minister Javad Zarif from 2013 onwards in Europe. So there's always, and so I mean,
but it's amazingly elastic at the end of the day, isn't it?
Absolutely.
No compromise. We will never compromise for our mission of the Islamic Republic, except if our power is threatened, and then we might have to compromise. We drink the poison.
So, exactly. So this is, of course, for that shift, all those leaders would prepare public opinion slowly but surely, always. But yes, because we have to understand that for many autocracies and dictatorships, if not for all of them, the prime interest that is driving their domestic politics, but also their foreign policy, is the security of their own vested interest. The security of the regime survival is the key aim. And this is why all the other aims are derived from this key aim.
Dr. Ali Fathollah-Nejad, I really appreciate the time today, and I really appreciate the insights in your book.
Thank you so much, Jian. I very much enjoyed the conversation, and I hope to continue it and talk about different other aspects that we've not been able to delve into.
Me too. We just scratched the surface. Thank you. Merci. Khodafez.
Khodafez.
Dr. Ali Fathollah-Nejad, a German-Iranian political scientist with an interest in Iran, the Middle East, and the post-unipolar world order. He is an associate fellow with the American University of Beirut's Issam Faris Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs, and the author of the monthly brief Iran in Focus. His new book, released in 2021, is entitled Iran in an Emerging New World Order, From Ahmadinejad to Rouhani. And Dr. Ali Fathollah-Nejad joined me from Berlin, Germany today. This is Full Time for the Roqe Media series, The Contemporary History of Iran, Part 20, brought to you with the support of Yazdani Law Group, one of Canada's largest immigration law firms, YLGPC. on Instagram. Please check out our regular editions of Roqe and all things related at roqemedia.com. That is our website, roqemedia.com. Thanks to the amazing team who make Roqe Media happen. Talented Anahita, Super Parisa, Ponta the Artist, Sabi Roham, Roqe Media, the fabulous Keon, Captain Reza, and Groovy Shaya. Thank you to all of you out there for supporting us and sharing our content. Please subscribe if you've not done so already. You can hear regular editions of Roqe every Monday on all these platforms. You can find me on Instagram at Jian Ghomeshi, and as ever, Mizun Bashin.